Today we're going to learn about the French and Indian War. This is not a war between the French and the Indians, but a war with the French and the Indians on one side and the British on the other. There were also Indians that fought on the British side as well. So let's look at the causes of the conflict. There are many. This is in large part a spillover of the conflict that Britain and France were having in Europe. And it spills over into the colonies because remember we have the British colonies on the East Coast, and France is in the Ohio Valley and up in Canada. By this time, the British have started moving into the Ohio Valley where both sides, the French and the British, start to claim land. And the French have already built forts in this region. But the British believe it should be theirs as well. So the colonies on the East Coast were starting to claim land west of the Appalachian Mountains. The colony of Virginia claimed what's now Kentucky, Ohio area. And so Virginia decided to send soldiers to the Ohio Valley to try to remove the French from the frontier, from this region. They sent the Virginia militia under the leadership of George Washington. Unfortunately, Washington is unsuccessful, and the French do stay in the Ohio Valley, just leading to more conflict between the two groups. Pretty early on, before we have official war, we have conflict between the French and the British, still under command of Washington here, at a fort called Fort Duquesne. So Fort Duquesne sits at the mouth of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. Those two rivers join together to form the Ohio River. Take a second and see if you can figure out which current city sits where Fort Duquesne used to be. If you guessed Pittsburgh, you were correct. Fort Duquesne is now the site of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers join together to form the Ohio. At this point, Washington attacks the French at Fort Duquesne and actually is able to defeat them. But the French are going to turn right back around and attack Washington at Fort Necessity. Washington then surrendered and returned to Virginia. So he failed to accomplish his goal. In the meantime, we have a meeting happening among colonial leaders called the Allegheny Congress. So this is a meeting of British colonial leaders, and they wanted to get the colonies to cooperate together in defending themselves. So at this point, each colony operated individually. They were in charge of their own government, their own taxes, and their own western settlements, their own western territory. And so this group at the Allegheny Congress is trying to get them to work together to unite against the French. They did also include the Iroquois tribe, but the Iroquois refused because they believed that the British would lose to the French at this point. Now, Benjamin Franklin was in attendance, and he is the one that proposes the Albany Plan of Union. This is what the Albany Congress put together as their proposal to create this united Congress. So they proposed creating a Council of Representatives that were elected by colonial assemblies. So this would be people from each of the individual colonies that would work together to control Western settlements. They would be in charge of the relations between the Native Americans and the colonies. They could organize an army to defend all 13 colonies, and they could collect taxes for the group. So the goal here would be to unite them together. Unfortunately, the colonies did reject this plan. They did not want to give up their authority. So at this point, because each colony was independent and controlled their own taxes and government and settlements, it would require them to give up some of that independence, some of their own control to a larger group. They did not see the French as a big enough threat to force them to do this. So they didn't want to give up that control to be able to unite together. If you look at that picture in the top right corner there, it says join or die, and it's a snake with the different colonies or regions on it, showing that if they're disconnected, that the snake will die. So this idea of we need to all work together to be successful. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen quite yet, but we'll get there eventually in a few weeks. During the actual war, let's talk about a few things that happened here. One of our first big battles happens at Fort Duquesne. The British are quite unsuccessful at this war, initially anyway, and they are defeated at Fort Duquesne. General Braddock was the British commander at this point, and he was killed at Fort Duquesne, and over half of his troops were killed or wounded as well. And this showed really that there's quite a different style of fighting. The British were marching in lines, and the French were fighting much more like the Native Americans, more of a guerrilla style fighting. They will also suffer many other defeats during the early years of this war, the early part of this conflict. The tide will eventually turn, though. We get a new prime minister in England, and he's going to pick new people to be in charge of the army, the British army in the colonies. And so William Pitt becomes the prime minister, and he picks some new generals. By 1758, things start to change for the British, and they are able to capture Fort Duquesne. They rename it Fort Pitt after William Pitt. Hence, now we have Pittsburgh. And the Iroquois do eventually decide to join the side of the British. In 1757, the British will capture the French capital of Quebec. This sat up on a cliff and was extremely difficult to attack, but the British managed to sneak up an unguarded trail and defeat the French here. After the French lose Quebec, they are unable to hold on to the city of Montreal as well, which will fall in 1760 and lead us to the end of the war. Now, this French and Indian War in the colonies is part of a much larger war, the 7 Years' War that's being fought in Europe. So the treaty isn't until 1763. Under this treaty, France will lose all of their North American possessions. So Britain will gain French Canada and all of their land east of the Mississippi River, as well as control of Spanish Florida. Spain will gain control of the port of New Orleans and all of the land west of the Mississippi River. So France loses everything that they have in North America, and it's divided up among Britain and France. This means that the British colonies now stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and then everything west of the Mississippi River is under Spanish control. Once the colonists gain control of that, or the British, I should say, gain control of all that land west of the Appalachian Mountains, the colonists want to settle there. This is new land, and that's going to lead us to another conflict. So our colonists start to head west of the Appalachian Mountains, but they are in the way, or going to be interacting with the Native Americans. And so the Native Americans don't want to give up their land just yet. And we're going to have a conflict between Pontiac, who is an Ottawa chief. He leads a Native American alliance that's going to then attack British settlements. So the British start moving into this land, into the Ohio Valley, to the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. They start taking Native American land. The Native Americans are going to attack back. In May of 1763, Pontiac attacked 6 different British forts, killing at least 2,000 settlers. And that's going to then force the British to retaliate and attack the Native Americans. They attacked any Native American they could find, not just the ones that were attacking them, including the Native Americans at Fort Pitt. It's during Pontiac's Rebellion we also see some early germ warfare. The British are going to use smallpox and smallpox-infected blankets to help attack the Native Americans as well. Now, the British decide that they don't really want to continue to defend the colonists against the Native Americans, and they're going to issue the Proclamation of 1763. So this is in direct reaction to Pontiac's Rebellion and is a law that banned settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So there was to be no British settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the British are not going to defend any colonists who do settle there. So if you were to settle there, you'd be breaking the law, and you wouldn't have any help fighting off the Native Americans. Well, the colonists don't take kindly to this because they believed that they should be able to settle wherever they wanted. They just spent all this time fighting this war against the French to have access to that land, and now they're being told, no, you can't go there. As a result, the Proclamation of 1763 is the first step towards the Revolution.